Scrub Dog of Alaska by Walt Morey. 8. Winter clamped an icy fist on the land. The snow depth increased. Fred estimated the river ice was 3 feet thick. The moose disappeared from their area, and David and Fred ran across a herd miles away, yarded in a cleared spot where the snow was not so deep and it was easier for them to move about. The caribou came. The ptarmigans arrived in flocks at the lower levels to winter in the willows. David and Celia took turns going out on the trap line. David now handled the team almost half the time when he was out with his father. Constant practice made him very good with the long whip. They glimpsed wolves many times, but the animals were almost instantly gone. The more the winter advanced and the colder it became, the more wolves they seemed to see and hear. They were skinning the day's catch in the number 2 cabin one night, when the sound brought David's head up with a jerk and goosebumps popped out on his arms. Wolves seemed to be all around them. He had heard individual wolves howl before, but never a chorus like this. It began low and rose, soaring into the frigid silence. He could even distinguish individual voices. Some were high and piercing, others low and soft. They blended into one wild harmony that filled the night. The sound faded and vanished, and the silence was greater than before. Then it started up again. Fred looked up from skinning a marten and smiled. "Wolves singing. Pretty, isn't it?" David said almost in a whisper. "It sounds like 100. I've never heard anything like this. They wouldn't come this close to a settlement like Aurora. There must be a dozen out there. What about the dogs? Nothing to worry about. Those wolves are enjoying themselves. They wouldn't be putting on a concert if they were hungry." David thought of Scrub often. He wondered where he was and how the team was doing in the small races Jackson would be entering. During his week at home, he began hiking to Nick and Jean Moore's at Aurora. The couple took the Anchorage paper, delivered once a week by Bush Pilot. The race results were usually listed. Nick was caretaker at the mine during the winter. He ran a short trap line on the side on snowshoes because he had no dog team. Jean was small, gray-haired, and friendly. At first, there were no announcements of Smiley Jackson's team. Then, one week, they were listed in 3rd place at Echo Lake. The next report said they'd won a 2nd place. Then they won 2 firsts in a row. A reporter had added a line at the bottom of the last announcement. "Keep an eye on this Jackson team. It's young and inexperienced. But Jackson has a lead dog he calls Scrub, who looks like a comer. He's big, strong, and fast." David yelled excitedly, "Jean, look, look!" Jean read the short article and smiled. "How about that? It looks like Scrub's doing all right. Who'd have believed he'd turn out like this when he was thieving everything he could get his teeth into around here?" "That's what made him fast," David said. "He had to run to live." "Could be. Anyhow, he just might put Aurora on the map. Now, wouldn't that be something?" 2 weeks later, the first blizzard of the winter hit. David and Fred had arrived home early that evening. The wind was building, shaking snow from the trees and swirling it through the air. The thermometer fell steadily. Fred looked at the lowering sky. He turned his face to the wind. "I have a feeling it would be a good idea to cut a lot of wood and stack it on the porch." They spent all the next morning splitting blocks and piling wood on the porch until there was only an alleyway to walk through. By evening, the first fine snowflakes were falling. David awoke in the middle of the night. He was cold, and the wind was howling at the sturdy corners of the cabin. He got out of bed and went to the window. Frost was a 1/4 inch thick on the glass. He held his palm against the frost until he'd melted a round spot to look through. There were no stars or moon. He could not see the sky. He could not even see the dog houses. Fine snow scudded so thickly across the frozen earth it seemed the land was moving. He got another blanket, spread it over his bed, and crawled in. He lay listening to the wind. The dogs would be all right in their houses and with their thick coats. There were 2 bales, 3,000 pounds of dried fish, stored in the fur cabin. His father would not go out to the trap line until the blizzard passed. He wondered how long it would last. With morning, the world was closed in a swirling mass of snow that pelted the cabin like fine shot. Cold cut through the thickest winter clothing when they went out to feed the dogs. Even with daylight, the dog houses were barely visible. Snow drifted against them, building mounds that left just the black hole of the opening clear. Not a dog was in sight. The thermometer on the porch registered 55 below zero and was still falling. It's going to hit bottom, sure, Fred predicted. Bottom was 60. There'll be little fur next trip. Everything living has hunted a hole until this blows over. The thermometer hit bottom, then rose slowly to 55 and hung there day after day. The icy air was constantly filled with pelting fine snow. The wind picked it off the frozen earth and drifted it against every conceivable obstruction. A protruding rock, brush, stump, a mound of earth. The snow even built tiny little mounds against single dead grass blades. The roof of the cabin was blown clear of snow. In back, snow drifted halfway to the eaves and made that wall warmer than any other. They kept the fire going night and day. By the end of the week, they had burned all the wood piled on the porch. David and Fred went into the storm and dug down through the drift of the woodpile to the woodpile. They dared not work fast and were particularly careful to breathe slowly and shallowly. A few careless deep breaths could frost the lungs and kill. All day they huddled about the stove, soaking up the warmth. At night, Celia piled on blankets. She heated up 2 big rocks on top of the stove for David's bed, wrapped them in newspapers, and shoved them under the covers. Several times during the night, David was wakened by his father stoking the stove. During the 10th night, David thought the voice of the wind was a little less violent. He melted a peephole in the window and peered out. Snow was still scudding across the yard. He could not see the sky or dog houses. It was wishful thinking. When he awoke again, it was still dark, but something was different. Then he realized the wind had stopped. He heard Fred's glad shout from the kitchen. "Roll out, everybody! The storm's over!" David dressed swiftly and joined his parents. "Come on," Fred said. "Let's have a look at the world we've got." They went out on the porch together. The clearing was blown almost bare, but snow was piled 4 and 5 feet deep against obstructions they couldn't even see. The air was clear and still. Compared to what it had been, 30 below and no wind felt almost balmy. Every brush and tree had been blown clean. They stood upright, in black silhouette against the white world. A covey of ptarmigans sailed over the clearing. A snowshoe rabbit popped out of the brush, hopped a few feet, and disappeared again. Wildlife was coming out to feed. The dogs were all sitting on their tails in front of their snow-covered houses. Noble barked his happiness that the storm was ended. "I've got to get moving fast," Fred said. "It's been 11 days since I've been on the line." He looked at Celia. "Maybe you'd better stay home this trip. It's going to be rough." "I know all about that. I was born in this country, remember? The blankets and everything else in the cabins will be frozen stiff. There'll be a couple of inches of snow on the floor where it drifted through cracks, and Lord knows what else. I'm going. This time you really need help. Besides, it's my turn. The trail will be drifted over too. It'll be hard traveling. So who's afraid of a little old storm? Just remember, I gave you a chance to back out." "Who wants it?" Celia asked. They rushed about, getting ready. David helped his father hitch up the dogs. An hour later, Celia was snug in the basket, surrounded by blankets and holding the rifle. She shouted, "Take care, David!" His father lifted a hand. "See you next week, Dave. Let's go, Noble." The whip cracked. The dogs lunged into the harnesses, yapping excitedly. They were happy to be on the trail again. David washed the dishes and cleaned up the house. He spent the rest of the forenoon chopping wood and piling a great rick on the porch again. In the afternoon, he hiked to Nick and Jean Moore's to search the Anchorage papers for any dog racing news that might mention Jackson and Scrub. There was none. For 4 days, the good weather held. The 5th morning, a new storm boiled out of the north and hit them. As Fred would have said, the old one just backed up for a new start. Wind howled at the corners of the cabin. Snow swept across the frozen earth to add to the drifts already formed. Again, the thermometer hit bottom. David didn't stir out except to bring in more wood. The storm lasted 3 days, then blew itself out as quickly as it had begun. Again, there was silence. The thermometer rose to 20 below and stayed there. Fred and Celia did not return, but David hadn't expected them. They'd have holed up in one of the cabins until the storm broke. The middle of the 8th day, David was preparing to go out to cut more wood when he heard dogs barking. He threw open the door, and there was Noble leading the team into the clearing, tongue hanging out, tail waving, happy to be home again. His mother was not bundled up in the basket. The musher was not his father. The figure riding the runners lifted a steel hook in greeting. Scotty's voice shouted, "Davy! Davy!" David jumped off the porch, and Noble rushed up to him. "Scotty, where's Mom and Dad? How come you've got the team?" "It's quite a story. Help me unhitch. Then we'll go inside and I'll tell you about it." "They staying at your place, in a manner of speaking? Help me with the dogs, Davy." David was bursting with questions, but he helped unhitch the team and stake the dogs to their houses. They went inside, and Scotty got out of his parka. He sat in a chair and motioned to another. "Sit down, David." David sat and waited. He'd never seen Scotty so sober. Scotty rubbed his hand over the hook of his left arm. He ran fingers through his hair. He seemed at a loss to begin. "This was a bad storm," he said finally. "Bad as we've had in a long time. The second one coming so soon was a real fooler." A cold finger probed at David's vitals. "Scotty, Mom and Dad are all right, aren't they? You said they were at your place." "Don't rush me, Davy. I'm doing the best I know how. Like I said, it was a bad storm. Your Mom and Dad didn't come, and they didn't come. Right in the middle of that second blow, I heard the dogs, and there they was, standing outside the cabin all alone. I started back right off, looking for your Ma and Pa. I found 'em, huddled behind a big rock in the snow. They'd tried to make it back to number 3 cabin, but they were a couple of miles away." "Then they're all right." The cold finger stopped probing. "They're at your place." Scotty shook his head. "I took 'em to my place. They're not all right, David. They were both froze to death when I found 'em." The words had no meaning. They were stones dropped into a quiet pool. He watched them sink and sink through crystal depths. Scotty's voice went on and on. "Maybe they had stopped to rest. Something spooked the dogs and they took off, leaving your Ma and Pa. Maybe the sled hit a rock or a stump or somehow went over a bank and spilled them out, knocking one or both of them out. And the dogs went on when nobody yelled to stop. They could have been working at a set, and the dogs took after a moose, a rabbit, or a fox. So many things could have happened. If there was ever any clues to what went wrong, the storm wiped 'em out and covered 'em up. All I know for sure is that somehow they became separated from the team. They tried to make it back to cabin number 3 and didn't. The team came to my place because they always have." "They're dead?" David whispered. "They're both dead." He began to shake. He gripped the edge of the chair as if he were falling. Scotty put his arms around him and held him close. Then David began to cry. The following days were a nightmare that Scotty led David through gently but firmly. It was Scotty who brought his parents back. Scotty made arrangements for the funeral. Through shortwave at the trading post, he got in touch with David's uncle, George Martin, in Anchorage. Uncle George came out by bush pilot. David had seen his uncle twice in his life, both times when he had come to visit for a couple of days. Uncle George was not as big as his father, but he had the same lean features and was raw-boned and dark. He had worked in one of the airports somewhere in the state of Washington and was transferred to Anchorage a little over a year ago. He held some kind of office job. After the funeral, Uncle George said, "David, I want you to come live with your Aunt Margaret and me. You've never met your cousins, Terry and Grace, but they're near your age and will be good company for you." "I don't want to leave here." "You can't live alone, can he, Scotty?" "I was on my own at his age, but I can tell you it's pretty lonesome. I'm sure Fred and Celia would want David to live with us." "What about his mother's people?" Scotty asked. "He's got uncles and aunts on that side of the family." "Do you know where they are?" "Not right off, or I'd have notified them. They fish along the coast and move about a lot. In time, they could be located. His parents wouldn't want David living that kind of nomad existence. He'll come to Anchorage." "That all right with you, David?" Scotty asked. "Do you want to live with your father's people?" David felt numb and lost. They were talking about him, planning his future life, but it seemed like it was someone else. It didn't matter. Uncle George was his uncle. He had taken charge and was making decisions. He guessed someone had to. "It's all right," David said. "I need Davy to help me for a few days," Scotty said. "We've got to go over the line and take up all the traps. He knows where they are. I don't. And we've got to move the fur stored here at my place where I can keep it for him." "How long will that take?" "Give us 10 days. There must be over 500 traps, and there'll be fur to skin and care for." Shall we say 10 days from tomorrow? Good. I'll send the bush pilot back for David. What disposition do we make of all these things that are left? The traps, the fur, the house, and furnishings. I can probably sell the traps and maybe the trap line next spring or summer. When the fur buyers come around next spring, I'll sell the fur and send you the money. There should be $6,000 or $7,000 in fur alone. You can put it in the bank for Davy. I might sell the cabin to the person who buys the trap line. Otherwise, out here, you just lock the door and walk away. He turned to David. I'll look after it in case you ever want to come back. There's one other thing, David. Nick and Jean Moore have offered to keep the team for you. Do you want to give them to dogs, or shall I try to sell them? Give them to the Moores, David said. I guess that covers everything, Uncle George said. I'm sorry to be loading you down with work, Scotty. Deduct whatever expenses you have, and I'll take what you think is right. And take what you think is right as pay for your time and trouble. No trouble, Scotty said. These are my friends. David's future was arranged, and he had scarcely listened. The next 10 days were hard for David. Finding the traps and taking them up was no problem. But there were so many memories along the line. He remembered the night at cabin number 2 when he and his father listened to the wolves singing. There was his first attempt at mushing, his father's patience with him in handling the team and teaching him how to make sets. And somewhere, beyond cabin number 3, was the rock behind which his parents had crouched and frozen to death, but he didn't ask Scotty where it was. When they finally made Scotty's cabin, they were loaded down with traps and fur. They cleaned out the spare room and left everything. Then they went on to David's home, where they loaded up with fur again. It required 2 trips to transport all the fur to Scotty's. It's a right nice harvest, Scotty observed, surveying the pile in his back room. We'll sell a few pelts to the trading post now, so you can have some walk-around money. Walk-around money? Spending money. Pocket money. There's things you'll want to buy in the city. How much money? Depends. I think you should give your uncle and aunt $200 for taking care of you. Then you'll need some clothes, and I don't know what all. Say somewhere between $400 and $500. Come spring, I'll sell your fur and send the money to you. You and your uncle can have a lawyer in Anchorage fix it up all legal and pay your relatives so much a month or a year as long as you stay. The fur they sold brought $450. It was more money than David had ever had in his life before. Nick and Jean Moore came for the dogs. Remember, David, they're yours any time you want them, Nick said. We'll just be keeping them for you. Thanks. David patted Noble's big head and scratched his ears. Noble licked his hand. He was a good dog, smart, gentle, and loyal. And he'd been kind to Scrub. David felt guilty that he didn't feel loss at leaving him. The plane came for him about noon. It dropped into the clearing on skis and ran to the cabin where David and Scotty waited. David had his few clothes in his father's old knapsack. Scotty shook his head. I'll come over every so often and check on the cabin. If you ever want anything at all, you know where I live. You remember that. I will. The plane's motor was still turning over. The cabin door was open. The pilot waited. This was the moment he'd been dreading and refusing to face for 10 days. He looked around. The Moores had already taken the doghouses. The cabin door was locked, the curtains drawn. No smoke curled from the chimney. Already it looked forlorn and deserted. He knew what would happen with no one here to care for it. The roof would eventually cave in from rot, the walls collapse. His parents' possessions would mold and rot. In a few years, the forest would grow over the clearing and claim the cabin for its own. All signs that a family had lived and worked and dreamed here would be gone. Something came up in his throat and began to choke him. The pilot asked, Ready, son? Scotty said, Good luck. Take care, David. He couldn't answer. He got into the plane and closed the door. The pilot said, Fasten your seatbelt, son. They roared through the snow and shot upward into the clear sky. The plane banked and thundered over the cabin. The small figure in the clearing lifted the stub of his arm in farewell. And that's the end of chapter 8.